But what I want to do today is talk some more about what determines the shapes of supply and demand curves, and just thinking about an overview of how we think about supply and demand interacting in a market and what determines how responsive individuals and firms are to prices. So what we've talked about last time, and once again, remember, everyone should have a handout. Should have picked up in the back on your way in. So everyone should have a handout. We talked about last time was the sort of qualitative effects, the qualitative version of the supply-demand model. We talked about what happens when a supply curve shifts, what happens when a demand curve shifts. We talk about how either a supply shock or demand shock could lead to the price to increase, but they could have very different effects on quantity, et cetera. What we didn't talk about is how big these effects are. I made up some numbers, I threw them on the graphs, but I didn't talk about where the size of those effects come from. And where they come from is the shapes of the supply and demand curve. And that's what we'll talk about today, is what determines the shapes of supply and demand curves. Okay, and that'll be the focus of today's lecture. I'll talk both theoretically about what determines these shapes and empirically about how economists go about figuring out the shapes of supply and demand curves. So to think about this, let's start with figure 3.1, which is a standard kind of market diagram we had last time, which is you're in some initial equilibrium at point E1 with initial price P1 and a quantity Q1. That's the equilibrium. That's stable because at that price P1, consumers demand Q1 units, and suppliers are willing to provide Q1 units. So that's a stable equilibrium. Now we have some supply shift. Last time we talked about somehow a pork-specific drought. Okay? That leads the supply to shift inward. So supply curve rises to S2. At that new price, initially you would have excess demand. But quickly the price increases to shut off that excess demand. And you end up at a new equilibrium with a higher price, P2, and lower quantity Q2, a new equilibrium point E2. Okay? And we talked that through last time. What I want to talk about this time is, well, what determines the size of that shift from Q1 to Q2 and that price increase from P1 to P2? What's going to determine it is the elasticity of supply and demand. The elasticity of supply and demand is how much do supply and demand respond? Do the quantities supplied and the quantities demanded respond when the price changes? When we say how elastic is demand, what we mean is how sensitive to price is the quantity demanded? Or alternatively, what is the slope of that demand curve? Okay? So the slope of the demand curve will be the sensitivity of quantity demanded to the price consumers face. And that will determine the market responsiveness. So to see this, the best way to see this in economics, it's always true the best way to think about things is to go to extremes. You have to remember extremes don't exist in the real world. Okay? But it's a useful teaching device. Think about extremes. So let's think about one extreme case. In figure 3.2, let's think about the case of perfectly inelastic demand. Perfectly inelastic demand, that's where there's no elasticity of demand. What that means is that demand for a good is unchanged regardless of the price. So perfectly inelastic demand is a case where demand for the good is unchanged regardless of the price. That would lead you to have a vertical demand curve at a given quantity. What this says is regardless of the price, people always demand Q. Okay? Can anyone tell me what would cause demand to be perfectly inelastic? In what types of situations would demand be inelastic? It's never perfectly inelastic. Would demand be relatively inelastic? Yeah? It's all about substitutes. When there's no substitutes, when there's nowhere to go, it doesn't matter what the price is. Okay? When there's no substitutes, demand will be perfectly inelastic because you have to have Q. It doesn't matter what the price is because there's nowhere else you can spend. There's no substitute for that good. So if you want an amount Q of that good for any reason, you're always going to want that amount Q no matter the price. So perfectly inelastic good would have no substitutes, and so you'd always want Q no matter what. Now what happens with inelastic demand when there's a supply shock? When supply increases, what happens? Well, in that case, there can never be excess demand because demand doesn't change. So all that happens is price just increases. If there's inelastic demand and the supply shock, then all that happens is an increase in price and no change in quantity. Okay, so inelastic demand, quantity doesn't change from a price increase. Price just goes up. From a supply shock, price just goes up. Now let's consider the opposite. Let's look at figure 3.3 and think about perfectly elastic demand. Perfectly elastic demand is demand where consumers essentially don't care about the quantity, they just care about the price. That is, there are infinitely good substitutes. A perfectly elastically demanded good would be one where there are essentially perfect substitutes. An inelastic good is where there's no substitute. A perfectly elastic good would be this perfect substitute. Literally, you are technically, if a good is perfectly elastically demanded, then you are completely indifferent between that good and a substitute. Well, if you're completely indifferent, then if the price changed at all, you would immediately switch. And so the price can't change. So basically, if there's supply shock to one provider to a provider that's facing a perfectly elastic demand curve, they cannot raise their price because people just switch. So quantity will fall a lot. Because if I'm supplying Eclipse gum, okay, and suddenly costs a lot more to produce Eclipse gum, but I can't raise my price because I'll lose all my business to Orbitz, I'm just going to produce a lot less Eclipse because I'm losing money now. So with perfectly inelastic demand, the quantity didn't change. With perfectly elastic demand, we saw a big quantity change. Okay? So more generally, what determines the quantity change in response to a price change is the elasticity. More generally, we're between these two cases, a perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic. And what's going to determine the price change is going to be the price elasticity of demand, epsilon, which is going to be the percentage change in quantity for each percentage change in price. The price elasticity of demand is the percentage change in quantity for the percentage change in price. So price elasticity of demand will typically be between 0 and negative infinity. And the larger it is, the more quantity will change when prices change.